All right, welcome back, y'all. Chapter 8, Establishing a New Government, 1777 to 1788. Now, a couple of things that we're going to be talking about is establishing a new government and what we had to do in order to get there. Now, some of the essential questions on 116 are: what are the Articles of Confederation? What conditions led Americans to change their system of government? What issues were resolved at the Constitutional Convention? And how well did the new Constitution embody the principles of the Declaration of Independence? Now, what is government? Well, by nature, human beings are social. They must live in communities in order to survive. Communities need to make rules, decide disputes, and protect their members from aggressors. The body given the authority to carry out binding decisions for a community is known as its government. In fact, the word govern comes from an ancient Greek word for steering a ship. Just as a pilot guides a ship, a government guides the conduct of the members of a community in their dealings with each other and outsiders. The government makes the rule that the members of the community must follow, and it has the power to enforce those rules. It represents the community in dealing with other communities. The power of government, such as the legislative power, the judicial power, and executive power, are all what makes up the idea. Now, the representative democracy that we know is people that are in a situation in which they must create a new government. Another question immediately arises is what type of government that they should create. Creating a government is a matter of great concern to each member of the society. Why do the people, whom they hardly know, power over their lives? And how much power can be given to a government without encouraging it to threaten their liberties or rights? Americans had many different types of governments from which to choose from their independence. They could have created a monarchy, a constitutional monarchy, or a representative democracy, which is ruled by popular elected representatives. In 1776, the colonists chose to establish a representative democracy. Creating a stable democracy proved to be a difficult challenge, however. Now, starting off, we'll begin with the Articles of Confederation, which was one of the very first forms of government that we had. It did not give much power to the federal the federal government, but it did give quite a lot of power to the states, which was part of its undoing. Now, the first government of the United States were actually established at the state, not national level. After declaring independence, each former colony became an independent state. Colonial charters were rewritten as state constitutions. Americans also recognized the need for some form of central or national government. The Continental Congress itself was inadequate to serve as a permanent form of national government. But because of their recent experiences with British rule, the former colonists were afraid of creating a central government that would be too powerful. The Constitutional Congress drafted the Articles of Confederation in 1776 and 1777 to solve the problem. After the Articles of Confederation were written, the document had to be approved by each state before it could become official. Although the articles were sent to the states in November of 1777, it almost took 4 years, until March of 1781, for each state to approve them in full. Now, the structure of the Confederation government. Members of the Continental Congress feared that the individual freedom might be threatened by the national government if it had too much power. Therefore, the Articles of Confederation deliberately placed more power in the hands of the individual state, making the new national government very weak. So the national government during the Articles of Confederation was extremely weak. It was only a loose association, a league of friendship, so to say, with only one branch of government, the Congress. Each state could send several delegates, but only had one vote in the new Confederation Congress. In this way, each state was given equal representation. The powers of the Confederation Congress were extremely limited. It could declare war and settle disputes between states, issue currency, and conduct affairs with Indian tribes and foreign countries. It could also command its own army, but it depended on the state in order to raise the soldiers for the army. There was no central executive or no national court system in the new government. So there was no president, and there was also no judicial court system set on a national level. The new Congress could not even collect its own taxes. For revenue, each state had given an amount to pay based on the value of its land. This was meant to cover the cost of providing the nation's common defense. The Articles of Confederation failed to include a way of requiring a state to turn over its tax monies to the Congress. So not only did it not have a system in place to collect taxes, but it depended on a state to give them partial monies. Now, it even goes on to say that it failed to include a way of requiring a state to do so. So sometimes they did, sometimes they didn't. Since the Confederation Congress relied on the states to give it money, it is not surprising that it found itself unable to pay its debts either at home or abroad. So it couldn't pay debts that were done here, and it couldn't pay the debts that it had across the seas in other courts, such as your France, your Britain, Spain. The states failed to supply the Confederation government with enough funds to meet its demand. The support of 9 states was needed to pass most laws, making it difficult for the new Confederation Congress to enact new legislation. The Congress also lacked the power to regulate the national economy. States could even tax goods from other states and issue their own money. Now, how would the fact that a state could issue its own currency affect the economy when you're dealing with state-to-state trade, or even going across a simple border just as a typical person just to trade? How do you think currency, which is money, dollar bills and coins at this point in time, but not back then, it was different coins, different types of payment. How does that affect your economy? How does that affect bartering, trading, selling, and buying? Now, the Articles of Confederation, the powers of the Confederation government was to declare war, negotiate treaties, manage foreign affairs, print its own money, establish a postal system, and establish a military from troops contributed by the states. So the troops were there to give the states were there to give troops to the army. Limits in confederational government. So these are what's limiting us, which is hindering us. There was no power to enforce the law. You had no national court to settle disputes between the states. You had no power to tax, and no power to regulate trade. You couldn't put tariffs on foreign goods. Now, the structure was that you had one branch of government, which was the Congress. You had one vote in Congress for each state, and no national executive or no national court. Now, one thing I do want to bring up is one vote in Congress for each state. Later on, as you read through this book, you'll learn that each state, based on its population, has a series of amount of votes. At this point in time, each state has its own vote, and only one. So a state such as Virginia, which is a very large state, has the same voting power such as Delaware, which is much, much smaller. Now, some of the achievements. Despite its shortcomings, the Article of Confederation created a national government that had some important achievements. It successfully concluded the peace treaty with Britain, ending the American Revolution. It helped develop the concept of a limited government, a system in which government only has certain powers and cannot act beyond its power was specifically given. The Articles of Confederation also developed the idea that American citizens included both privileges and immunities, which were rights to take certain actions without penalty. State governments could not deny these privileges and immunities to citizens who came from other states. The Confederation Congress also passed the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. These acts prohibited slavery in the Northwest Territory, encouraged free public education, and granted both religious freedom and a trial by jury. Procedures were also established for governing the Northwest Territory, which was divided into smaller territories, which is shown in that picture on page 119. Northwest Ordinance introduced a method for admitting these territories into the Union as new states once a population of 60,000 people were achieved within each territory. The new states were admitted on terms of complete equality with the original 13 states. Now, the Northwest Ordinance, make sure that you highlight that and make sure that you go under and understand it, because that is a very high keynote topic when you are going through the STAR test, and it will be on there. I can almost guarantee you. Okay, so make sure before you move on that you understand what the Northwest Ordinance is, and that you somehow, some way manage to jot that down. The nation adopts a new constitution. Historians often refer to the years of the adoption of the Articles of Confederation as the critical period of American history. George Washington described this as a time in which the states were held together by a rope of sand. And if any of you are aware, sand cannot be made into a rope. Just throwing that out there. Now, the new government established by the Articles of Confederation suffered from many weaknesses. The Confederation government had no national executive and could not tax. It had no president and it could not collect money. Because it had no way of forcing states to obey, because it couldn't enforce the law, the decisions of the Confederate Congress were more advertising than binding, meaning that they were more to advise you than actually enforce you. In seeking to limit the powers of the central government, American leaders had gone too far. They had created a national government with too little power to govern effectively. So, in their cautiousness, they overstepped their own boundaries and made a power which was too weak. Way to go, guys. Now, they had created a government with too little power to govern officially. The new system had also not met the needs of the growing economy. States were allowed to tax goods from other states. No uniform currency existed, meaning there was no overall money system such as the dollar bill and coins nowadays that you're used to seeing. There existed was a shortage of currency, which means that there was not enough money going around. And unemployment was widespread, meaning that there were not enough jobs. The Confederation Congress was unable to protect manufacturing and shipping. Land values saw no rise in value because the government could not defend its borders nor protect settlers living on the frontier. Shays' Rebellion, which is also a key note that you probably need to highlight and underline and all that goodness. Shays' Rebellion. A crisis soon arose that brought these weaknesses into sharp focus, meaning that it quickly brought a magnifying lens into the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Poor farmers, many of them former soldiers in the Continental Army, were upset over the growing debt, falling farm prices, and high state taxes. Failure to repay the debt at this time often resulted in imprisonment in debtor's prison, which is to get thrown in jail because you can't pay your taxes or your debts. In 1786, an uprising of farmers known as Shays' Rebellion broke out in Massachusetts. The rebels wanted to stop state courts from seizing their property and imprisoning them for unpaid debts. They also wanted the state to issue paper money. There was no national army to put down the uprising if it had spread to any other state. Although the state militia was able to put it down, many property owners across the country now felt the need for a stronger national government. So what ends up happening is Shays' Rebellion was a group of farmers who rose up and said, hey, something needs to be done about this, and I'm not going to go to jail because I can't pay for the taxes because there's not enough jobs or because of the failing farm prices. And what ends up happening is they rise up. Now, luckily enough, the state of Massachusetts was able to put them under control. However, had it spread to other states, who knows? Maybe it could have, maybe it wouldn't have gone very nicely. The one major thing is it formed the idea that we needed a very strong government in order to consist of the situations that we needed. Now, the Constitutional Convention, a meeting of representatives at Annapolis in 1786, called for a convention of delegates to revise the Articles of Confederation. Since only 5 of the 13 states were represented, they agreed to assemble again a few months later in Philadelphia. In May of 1787, representatives from the states met in Philadelphia to revise the Articles of Confederation. George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, and Alexander Hamilton were among the delegates. The representatives quickly agreed on discarding the Articles of Confederation. Instead, they decided that a new national government was needed. So they're going to throw the whole thing in the garbage pan and start anew, which is something that needed to be done. Now, there was agreement, disagreement, and there was also compromise. Woo! Once again for compromise. Now, the delegates of the Constitutional Convention generally agreed on the need for strengthening the national government and for creating a national executive, legislative, and judiciary. But they did not agree on all of the issues. For example, they could not agree on how states should be represented in new Congress. Should states be represented according to their size? Another issue concerned slavery. Once again, slavery is thrown in there. Should the states count their slave population when determining many representatives they should have in Congress? A third issue concerned taxes. Should the new national government be able to tax exports, which is a good that is sold abroad, meaning it's sold out to, like, for example, Britain, Spain, England, anywhere across the seas. For a time, it appeared that the Constitutional Convention might even break up over some of these issues. But the delegates finally reached a series of compromises. A compromise is an agreement in which each side makes concessions to the other side in order to resolve the dispute. The Great Compromise. Please underline this. Highlight it. Take notes. Put a sticky note on it. Let's do this. The first compromise delegates reached was over the state representation. Virginia was a larger state. I threw that out there earlier, guys. James Madison of Virginia proposed a plan in which each state should be represented in Congress in proportion to its population. Delegates from New Jersey, a smaller state, objected. I threw that out there earlier, such as Delaware, small state, New Jersey, small state. They are objecting because of the fact that their size is not the same as Virginia. They proposed equal representation for states, just as they had under the Articles of Confederation. However, delegates from the larger states agreed to a compromise to prevent the departure of all of the delegates of the small states. Delegates from Connecticut proposed a Congress with 2 houses to solve the problem. 3/5 compromise. A second disagreement concerned the counting of slaves. Southern states wanted slaves to be counted as part of their population for representation in Congress. Northern states with fewer slaves opposed the idea. Who would have thought? Northern and Southern delegates also disagreed over whether the new Congress should be allowed to regulate or even outlaw the slave trade. The North wanted Congress to regulate the slave trade, while Southerners opposed it. It also raised the issue of whether slaves would be counted in determining the taxes a state paid the federal government. Now, if you take note, in 1790 to 1800, which is a difference of 10 years, all of the populations ended up growing, such as your white, your free non-white, or your slave. But take a note on how much your slave population bumped up just in 10 years. Now, I'm not going to read over this. I want you to go in page 123. Please go in, highlight the major constitutional compromises, underline it. Please be ready to talk about that on Monday, so that way you're able to have quite the discussion. The Commerce Compromise. Another dispute involved the taxing of trade. Southern landowners who sold cash crops to England feared taxes on exports of their tobacco and other crops. In the Commerce Compromise, the delegates agreed to prohibit all taxes on exports, which are goods that are sold to foreign countries. Only imported goods could be taxed. That means coming into the states. The delegates also agreed that Congress could not regulate or limit the slave trade for at least the next 20 years, until 1808. Now, I'm on 123. I'm going to take a stop there because it's already 21 minutes in. So, I'll be ready to pick back up on organization of a new government. I'll see you then. Bye now.